In this video, we're going to be looking at graphing and data analysis 1.4 as a part of Unit 1 Scientific Inquiry. And we're going to begin by talking about how data is represented in science. It's very simple stuff that you've talked about and looked at before, but you maybe never really categorized in your mind, I guess, which is important. So we will do a lot of graphs in this class as a part of our labs or as a part of other assignments. And knowing what type of graph to use and what graphs show you is very important in scientific classroom. We will use lots of tables. You can see the table there on the left. A table is just a way to organize data into rows and columns so that you can easily read it and understand the table. And a graph will often represent that data on the two axes that we talked about in a previous lecture that show the variables in that controlled experiment, whereas the independent axis or the independent variable is going to be the x-axis. This is the variable that's being manipulated in the experiment, and the dependent variable is going to be the y-axis. This is the variable that is being counted. So you can look at this particular graph, the effects of different liquids on plants, and the x-axis is the different liquids, right? You have the water and the root beer and the milk. That's a strange experiment. I just didn't realize looking at this, but anyway, so that's the thing you have. You're manipulating those things, and then apparently there's some sort of measure on the left that goes up to 50. We're not given that unit. We're going to talk about, well, that's important in a minute, but you can see that here, because 50 what? We'll never know. So let's look at the different types of graphs. The first one that we're going to talk about is a bar graph. This is the graph that most students default to, but it's not always the appropriate graph. This is showing comparison between categories. You can see this particular picture showing different things. Some kind of bears, I'm sure. Yeah, it is bears, of course. And it's comparing years, like the bears in a certain amount of space over the course of years, and you can just compare, right? This is a line graph, and this is the female with cubs population index. It's probably bears as well. And what are they basing their numbers off of? Years. And so they are tracking something. And so when you use a line graph, you're showing progression. You are this is basically showing changes in the independent variable or the dependent variable based upon the independent variable over time, or usually over temperature or something like that that is being tracked. A pie graph, which this shows wildlife population. Apparently there's 3 kinds of wildlife now: whales, bears, and dolphins, and this shows you their spread. So the pie graph is showing you the percentage of a whole, right? Because the pie represents the whole, and whales take up a particular piece of that pie, and bears another piece, an equal piece for bears, whereas dolphins are going to come out on top, taking up most of the pie. You would use a comparison here when you're trying to show comparison of the individual parts to the whole. And then lastly, a scatter plot. This is not about bears. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Or whales or something. But it's showing you the relationship between 2 variables that aren't necessarily linked. So this shows weight and length. You might, in your head, think that there's a relationship between weight and length, but then you would graph those 2 things to show whether or not there's a relationship. And depending on which way the graph goes, which is beyond the scope of this class, there may be a direct or an indirect relationship between those 2 things. And I don't think we're going to talk about that very much in this class, but in my AP class we talk about that, and of course in a stats class you would talk more about that. So let's talk a little bit about graph construction. This is really important. And we're going to spend a little bit of time here to talk about the different parts of a graph and why they're important. So the first thing is the size of your graph. And this graph is the correlation between the wingspan and beak length for Geospisa scandens. I'm guessing it's some sort of bird, but it's not important what it is. It's just this graph shows you the different things that are going on. So one of the biggest things that students will do is they will draw their graph really small in one of the corners of their paper, as if it's the last piece of paper that they're ever going to own. And they need to save each little spot of it. And so, no, a graph needs to be like, a third to a half of your page is a good standard. But go ahead and use the whole page if you want to. Just your graph needs to be a good size. Why? So that it can be read. Well, let's say that you have your x-axis and your y-axis on the whole size of your paper, and you're really happy about it. But then you put all the entire graph is in the corner of that x and y axis. That means that your graph is not appropriately scaled. So you've chosen to have a big graph, but you've not appropriately scaled your numbers. See at the bottom here of this graph, notice how it starts with 70 over there on the, at the point. You don't always have to start at 0. So if your first measurement is 70, but you start at 0, your entire graph is going to be over on the right-hand side. And you're going to have a ton of wasted space. And so they have appropriately scaled their graph to make it easier to read. And the same thing with the beak length. 8 is the smallest beak length, right? And so you don't have to start that point at 0. Sometimes it's necessary to do that, but in this case it's not. Each square of the graph, or imaginary square in the case of this particular graph that's there, is an appropriately scaled amount, and I think that is important. And that scale should be the same throughout the x-axis and throughout the y-axis. The x and the y don't have to have the same scale, which obviously this graph doesn't, right? They don't have the exact same scale, but the x-axis is consistent with itself and the y-axis is consistent with itself. We will demonstrate scaling in class, and so this may be the most difficult part for students to kind of grasp, but we will talk about it. Of course, orientation of the graph is important. What you are making sure your axes are correct. Your dependent variable is on the y-axis and your independent variable is on the x-axis. In a scatter plot like this, it doesn't matter necessarily because you're just comparing two variables. But in a controlled experiment where you're having measurements that are based upon something else, those axes will definitely matter. And so determining your variables at the beginning is important. Correctly labeling your graph. Notice I am able to look at this graph and tell what each axis represents. I'm also able to tell what these numbers represent. 80. It's not just a random number like on our other graph with root beer and milk growing plants, right? This is in millimeters, so I can see that, right? It's very clearly marked. The units are there, the axes are labeled, the graph itself, those numbers are there to see, and so it's very plainly labeled. This graph is not titled. It should be titled up above the graph, but there is a caption below to help me understand what's going on in the graph. So again, very important to label things, and you can see how they've even labeled their data points and have like a legend to their graph. So having a legend is sometimes important, particularly if you're going to have more than one thing represented on your graph, which a lot of times in science we do. It's not just a simple line. It's more maybe 4 lines, and so you need to have a legend. Well, these 4 colors represent these 4 lines. You get the idea. Plotting, be consistent. With your plotting, this is going to have to do with your scaling as well. So when you plot your points, make sure that you're using precision in doing that. That you're basically the same. You think about your plots the same every time. Having 2 different people plot the same graph would not be a good idea unless the squares are a lot smaller, so it's easier to be precise. And then choosing the correct type of graph. When you're showing progression, of course, you're going to have a line graph, which is used a lot in science. A scatter plot doesn't need a line in it, so like this would be a scatter plot, so it's just points. You could draw a line in it, like a best line of fit, but this beyond the scope of this class. And so to make sure your graphs you're choosing the correct type of graph is going to make a big difference as well. And when we draw graphs in this class, last thing is you need to use the pencil for the whole thing, because if you're drawing a graph and you're constantly having to mark things out, it just makes it really ugly. So use a pencil. Anytime you turn something in to me, like a digital sort of thing, like a project or paper or something like that, it is going to have a digital graph in it, and I'll teach you how to make those using a program like Google Sheets or Excel. And so again, graphs are a really important part of science, and we take effort in order to make sure that they are drawn correctly so that they can represent our data.